All right, welcome everyone, both here on Zoom and on YouTube. And thank you so much for coming to Licton Springs Review's first author panel of the year. I'm very excited to introduce you to our guests, but just have a few pieces of business to take care of first. So, I just lost my notes. So first of all, my name is Jim Jewell. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Licton Springs Review faculty advisor. We produce the campus visual and literary arts publications, including the newsletter, the LSR Monthly, and the annual journal, the Licton Springs Review. Submissions are always open, and we accept work from students, staff, faculty, and alumni, whether that's poetry, prose, nonfiction or fiction, or visual art. And even in our monthly newsletter, we can accept recordings of performances. More information, if you're interested, is available at lictonspringsreview.org. I also want to take just a moment before we get started for our land and labor acknowledgement. Go ahead and get that. And I just realized I said all of that and had my mic off, didn't I? That's all right. What I did instead was, and I just see it. Skylar did, in fact, put that in the chat. So I gave you a moment to consider our acknowledgements. I will just add that the one thing I called out in the middle there is, while these are really important acknowledgements, we also highly encourage active allyship here at North. And one way to do that is real rent Duwamish. And like I told my interns before we even started this event, this is like live TV. So sometimes things don't work perfectly. And of course, that would start with me. So I do want to introduce our guests, but after I introduce the guests, each of them is going to take a little time to share some of their work with us before we launch into a Q&A. And we have some questions that we have prepared in advance, and then we'll also accept questions from any of the folks, whether you're joining us on YouTube or Zoom. You can type your questions into the chat. But first, I'm going to introduce Scott O'Moore. Scott O'Moore is the author of Battle of the Linguist Mages, a science fantasy novel, and Your Favorite Band Cannot Save You, a sci-fi horror novella, both published by Tor.com. A second novel is due in 2023. For 14 years, Scott was an active playwright in Seattle with major productions nearly every year during that time, and 45 short plays produced as well. I had to include that last part especially so that I could add that I have actually had the honor of sharing a stage with Scotto in the past. Welcome, Scotto.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Welcome. And then our other guest today is Laura Da. A poet and a public school teacher, Laura Da studied creative writing at the University of Washington and the Institute of American Indian Arts. A lifetime resident of the Pacific Northwest, Da is a recipient of fellowships from the Native Arts and Culture Foundation, Richard Hugo House, and the Jack Straw Writers Program, and has been a writer in residence for Richard Hugo House, and is the current poet laureate for the city of Redmond. She is the author of Tributaries, winner of the American Book Award, and Instruments of the True Measure, winner of the Washington State Book Award. Da is Eastern Shawnee. She lives near Renton with her husband and son. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks so much, and thanks for that kind introduction.
Yeah, and I believe that you're going to be sharing some work with us first today.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to sharing a few poems and just want to offer my gratitude to everyone for putting this together. And I'm really excited for the collaboration around being able to talk out some of these questions, and just lots of thanks to the hard work that folks have put into this. And of course, a warm welcome to folks who are watching on YouTube or who will access this later as well. I think what I'd like to do is I'm going to read a few shorter poems, and I'd like to begin with a poem that I think orients me in a place, and in this case, because I'm speaking to you today from Snoqualmie land, which is where I actually have spent most of my life. But as a Shawnee citizen, my kind of homeland original river would have been like the Scioto Valley. So I want to read a poem that talks about that space. And then I'd like to read a few that kind of speak to the Cedar River, which is the closest tributary near my home. So I'm going to begin with a poem from my most recent book called Instruments of the True Measure. And this poem is called Nationhood, and it talks about the lenses that kind of inform Shawnee territory. I'm a citizen of two nations, Shawnee and American. I have one son who is a citizen of three. Before he was born, I learned that, like all infants, he would need to experience a change of heart at birth in order to survive. When a baby successfully breathes in through the lungs, the heart changes from parallel flow to serial flow, and the shunt between the right and left atriums closes. Our new bodies obliterate old frontiers. North America is mistakenly called nascent. The Shawnee Nation is mistakenly called moribund. America established a mathematical beginning point in 1785 in what was then called the Northwest Territory. Before that, it was known in many languages as the Eastern Range of the Shawnee, Miami, and Huron homelands. I do not have the Shawnee words to describe this place. The notation that is available to me is 40 degrees, 38 minutes, 32.61 seconds north, 80 degrees, 31 minutes, 9.76 seconds west. And I wanted to share that poem first because I think that one of the things that I hope to kind of chat about when it comes to poetry and poetics is the way that it can hold a certain ambiguity. And in this case, I feel like there's an inherent ambiguity of what a hometown is or what a place of origin can be. So I'll just share two more. And in this case, I want to kind of come closer to the space that I'm inhabiting right now. So I'm kind of living, and I spent most of my life between the Snoqualmie River system and the Cedar River system. So these next two poems, which are both quite brief, consider the history of colonialism and also of place on those river systems. This poem is called Great Founders' Axe. Early accounts of cedars lining lower reaches of the Cedar River estimate circumferences of 100 feet. The wood is gone, the blade misremembered. Who swings the axe to crack wafers of such godly size? First blows hew deep fissures of erasure, while the last have yet to land. Beg a timepiece to pin down an analog for the word early. Forgiveness is to decision, as a living tree is to decision, as mortality is to a good watch, heavy in pocket, solid in hand. And I think what I'd like to do is just end with that poem so that we have ample time to hear other work and to just be able to chat some of these great questions. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was lovely. Scotto, we'd like to invite you in to share a little bit of work next.
Sure. Thank you for having me and for setting this up. It's really appreciated. I wanted to really quickly try to read the first sliver of the first chapter of my first novel, just to give you a taste. It's called Battle of the Linguist Mages. And here you meet our main character, Isabel Bailey, for the first time before the stories had a chance to come along and kind of kick her in the face and get started. So this is the beginning of the book. I am the queen of Sparkle Dungeon. No, but seriously, that's my ranking on the leaderboard. Queen of Sparkle Dungeon, the finest player to ever set foot inside its glittering tunnels and cavernous cuddle pits. No one but me has ever played a perfect game of Sparkle Dungeon. I have done so 3 times, once while restricting myself to nothing more than a moonbeam kaleidoscope as a weapon. I was the first to meet the villainous boss, Sandpaper Slim, and defeat him and his highly irritating, especially against bare-skinned minions. To this day, no one has ever finished Sparkle Dungeon 3, Mirror Ball and Chain faster than me. And one time I beat Sparkle Dungeon 2, Glow Sticks and Gemstones while running in a slow-ass emulator on Windows XP just to own the Sparkle Bros. Right now, I'm getting my ass seriously kicked. I'm in the midst of the final battle of Sparkle Dungeon 4, Assassins of Glitter. By my side is the sole surviving member of my raiding party, the Keeper of the Moonlight Prism. You might think I'd be worried, surrounded by, wait for it, Assassins of Glitter, with their villainous leader, Rhinestone Randall, lobbing glitter bombs at us from atop his tower of stolen Chicago house records, looking absolutely smashing in a gleaming metallic leisure suit and sporting a sparkling golden bouffant. You might think I'd be tired of dodging armor-piercing bedazzler rays and slashing my way through corrupted glam rockers who thought adding electronic beats to their back catalog would gain them relevance with the EDM festival crowd. But I want those stolen Chicago house records. I'm pretty sure some really good funk records are in that stack too. I bring out my electronic dance mace and start swinging, smacking assassins out of my way in time to the soundtrack, which is thumping along at an aggressive but not unpleasant 130 beats per minute. In my offhand, I'm periodically blasting holes in assassins with a kaleidoscope. In this game, kaleidoscopes are beam weapons, not toys. Next to me, the Keeper of the Moonlight Prism is wielding her namesake magic item, spraying concentrated moonlight all around us, which partially shields us from attacks and partially distracts our foes by lighting up the room with gorgeous, mesmerizing patterns that would look very pretty projected on the ceiling of a chill room. The assassins are still doing their share of damage despite our efforts. My diamond armor is cracked and chipped all over the place, and the Keeper's meteorite shield is in tatters. Could use a heal, she says. I have about 20 healing spells in my arsenal, most of which we used getting this far, but I do have one last trick up my sleeve on that front. I cast an uplifting encore spell, which gives us a nice fat hit point bonus and about 5 minutes of temporary boosts to all our stat pools, as well as changing the soundtrack to an excellent deep house cut I've got queued up for the occasion. That's the last one, I tell her. Are you holding back here, she says, as we grind our way through an endless sea of assassins. That's the problem, really. Rhinestone Randall is churning out new assassins somehow, wearing us down on our way to face him. I just want to get a little closer, I tell her. That's good. Stop there.
Thank you so much for that, Scotto, and thank you, Laura, as well. I love that the variety that we have between the two of you today. Very different styles, and yet I brought, like, when I sent the editors out to find folks to be a part of this panel, I asked them to find working writers, like writers who are, not. I don't know if there's ever a point where we have achieved all the success we want and stop writing. It seems like that there's some kind of higher stratosphere, but the more of we are still trying to put a life together. We are working at our writing constantly, and so one thing I want to start with is just something that you've learned that has surprised you while working in this field. Like, being a working writer, have you learned anything that you've found to be surprising? I would drop myself out of the spotlight just for a minute so I can put myself in a better spot. Focus on you more.
I guess one thing from just a business standpoint is that I've discovered that publishing is very slow, and it just works at its own pace. It's very methodical, and it can mean from the life cycle of a project, from germination to the time you might see something published can be multiples of years, and that's very common for people, especially depending on how much revision you intend to do. So you hear about authors who get in a cadence of publishing every year. That's one example. In some genres, they're publishing 2 or 3 times a year. This is for novels or young adult novels or that kind of thing. But they might have started a given novel or a given series many years back before they finally see something come out. And it's just how long it takes. The editors at their publishers have queues that they have to work through, and you have this weird bottleneck called a printing factory or whatever, where the books literally physically can't all be printed at the same time. And with the supply chain issues right now, there's paper shortages and all kinds of stuff. My book got delayed by 6 months just for that. So there's a lot of stuff that just I'd never had any idea was going on behind the scenes in publishing before.
Yeah, the complexities of the business.
Yeah.
Laura, how about you?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I think that one perspective I have, and I would say I've been a working writer for about a decade, is that unlike other career paths, my experience has been when it comes to sort of skill building with writing, there's sort of infinite capacity to improve. So whereas I feel like with a lot of other career paths or kind of parts of my life, there's a more classic, maybe 3 to 4 year apprenticeship of sort of extreme learning, and then something of a plateau. With writing, I've yet to encounter that plateau. I get the sense that you can kind of perpetually be learning and improving. And I think that that is a really interesting part of the writing life or career, is that it invites that kind of lifelong learning experience of always being able to be improving, but not much of a plateau in my experience.
Well, and I know that you are a K-12 educator as well. And what you just described is something that I've found to be true of teaching. And that has been like, I know that I will constantly be growing in this role, and that it means I can last in this role longer. Like there's less burnout when you're constantly growing in that way.
Yeah, I think writing and teaching share a lot in that way, that they're so rooted in inquiry and curiosity. That may be why so many writers are teachers, but they share a lot of commonalities, I think.
I think it also helps that it's really hard to make a living at either one. So you have to combine them together and you can kind of cobble a living together. So how about, given that we're focusing on being working writers, and maybe I'll start with Laura on this one. Do you have a daily or regular writing habits, and what are they?
Yeah, I would define my writing habits as regular more than daily, but I certainly have strong seasonal patterns of writing. So I would say within the course of a year, there are always, for me at least, strong seasons that are research and reading focused. And then there are seasons that are generative. And then there are seasons that I would say fall to the executive functioning of publication and making a living. And so there's a seasonal pattern to my writing life. When it comes to a daily pattern, I would say that I am a daily reader, and through that kind of writing lens of reading to kind of inform and engage with writing. And I kind of allow myself ample liberty to, not always be generative. So I don't write every day, but I do engage in some kind of poetic research or reading every day. And then I let the seasonal patterns inform me, and I sometimes try to inform them.
So are those seasonal patterns that are like just the seasons of Laura Da, or do they match up with like the seasons of weather? Because I know there's certain times of the year that tend to, I produce more in the fall than I do in the spring every year.
Yeah, I think we're all deeply impacted by time and place, which is just another way to define seasonality. So they're both mine, and I really do think they're informed by the seasons. And then in writing and in poetics in particular, there are seasonal forces. So for example, when you're looking at poetry publishing, generally speaking, the summers, there's not a whole lot of it because poetry is sort of dominated by university presses. So they sort of go silent. And so for me, that means summers are incredibly generative, and I don't use any of that time to think about publishing. I think also because the days are long, it just sort of fuels creativity for me. And I find winters to be a really natural time to just dig into research. And I think there are human patterns that are inherent to that as well, that winter is a time of study for a lot of cultures and a lot of people.
Right. Scotto, how about you? What are your writing habits like?
When I'm active on a big project, I do try to write every day, and I'll write 7 days a week, and just really stay in it as much as I can. And then in between projects, I'm deeply invested in not writing and letting my brain recharge. And I have, one of my main passions outside of writing, I have a hobby of sort of collecting and previewing short films and music videos, and I write a newsletter, kind of sharing that stuff. And so that to me is creative rejuvenation by experiencing the best of art forms that I don't work in, so that I can just be inspired by, things that I wouldn't seek out on my own necessarily. I'm kind of pushing myself to learn about different, corners of the arts world that I haven't come across. I mean, you're encouraged by your peers to read a lot, and that's absolutely important. But I've found that if I stick to just reading stuff that's similar to what I do, then that's all then I don't quite get the surprises that I'm looking for, to keep me motivated to create. When I'm under deadline, it can get very hairy, because, deadlines don't necessarily, if you're on the deadline, it doesn't necessarily wait for inspiration. You kind of have to be in the chair, making inspiration kind of flow out of you, whether you like it or not. And I get into these strange cycles where my sleep patterns become very, very choppy, because I want to just leap out of the chair at points and just try to get the next thing done. And then I'm exhausted and I have to sleep. And it's this ping pong back and forth. But good planning means you don't get into that situation. The flip side is you can't always, tell when inspiration is going to hit. Sometimes you're dry for a little bit and you have to deal with that too. So.
Well, if ever the idea of not being able to plan for everything resonated with me, it'd be at the end of the last 2 years as an educator. You definitely could not have planned for those. So you both kind of touched on this, and I think a little bit more, Scotty, you did. There are times where you might be, because with a deadline, driven to need to produce. And those times are going to be the times probably that we run into writer's block. Do you have sort of go-to tricks for dealing with writer's block, or either handling it or getting past it?
I wouldn't say I have tricks, but the one thing as I was thinking about this question, I get some newsletters that kind of round up pithy quotes about writing, and they're meant to be inspirational and whatnot. But writer's block is this kind of touchy subject where it's like you get a lot of people who kind of claim that there's no such thing as writer's block, that it's just, and that kind of is throwing shade at people who experience it. But there's a really good quote by I think Toni Morrison, who kind of just says, she teaches writing as well, and she teaches her students that there is writer's block and you should respect it. You shouldn't, I think what she says is you shouldn't write through it. It's blocked because it ought to be blocked, and you just have to accept that. And that's actually a nice mental trick to give yourself permission to sit down somewhere else and kind of, when you're writing, the mind is always kind of subconsciously processing some part of the problem that you're facing. So it's okay if you let your conscious mind kind of drift away from it for a little while. And I think by forcing yourself to, pretend that it's not happening, that's definitely to me, kind of a hazard. I think it's a way to delude yourself that you have a problem at the moment.
Right. Laura, how about you? What's been your experience of writer's block or getting past it?
Yeah, I think that writer's block does bring a lot of people feelings of insufficiency, and I personally really do root writer's block and as a frustration in a place of scarcity. And I think that the literary world can enforce that worldview. Things like one opportunity being the be all end all, and being caught in a place that's not generative during that opportunity can feel devastating. But writers as individuals, I think, can challenge that kind of scarcity model by allowing a little bit more agency. And I agree, writing block is to me a very sort of capitalistic imposition upon a creative process. So I try to just allow it to be a part of the mind that is not immediately generative. And I think that it's really important that writers of all stages, particularly young and emerging writers, hear that your gifts and talents, they don't leave you. So even if one opportunity presents itself and you're in the midst of a moment in time when you're not producing new work, the opportunities will come. you'll find them again. So being able to kind of drift into more of an abundance kind of mindset, I think is a really important way to question some of that dominant narrative around production. So I try to just be really zoom out to a bigger picture when it comes to being in a place of writer's block. And when I have pushed through, usually I'm not entirely satisfied with the work.
Well, and that sounds like that approach really requires some trust and faith in oneself. You know, you have to believe that the talent's going to come back, that you're not out of ideas, because I imagine every one of us who has tried to engage writing on any level has at some point felt like there are no more ideas left. My head, like I'm never going to have another good one. So that faith and that trust to believe that actually will come back is, well, and as an educator, how do you encourage that? How do you encourage that in young writers?
Yeah, I think one really powerful thing to look at as a writer is look outside the writing world for your metaphors, so that you don't have such a direct vision into the loss of a story or the loss of inspiration. If you can engage outside of that sort of narrow focus, not only will you get more ideas, but you'll find there are more models in different worlds and different kind of disciplines of the land, of different kind of parts of science. Being able to look outside of the literary world for your metaphors, I think, is really powerful. So I always think, you know, a depleted land will not produce well. And it's not the land's fault. And it won't be depleted forever, but it needs care. And that metaphor, I think, is really compelling to me, as opposed to like the young genius writer burnout metaphor. So yeah, I think expand your metaphor bank. And that as a thinker can really be helpful.
Well, and Scotto, it sounds like you really actively try to do that by seeking out your during your non-writing time, things that are not writing focused with which to fill yourself up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still kind of reading, you know, I read to a friend every day just as part of our kind of, you know, just staying connected over long distances and whatnot. And so we're definitely keeping current with some of the you know, the newest stuff or what have you. But I get a lot of juice when I come across like a music video that does something really surprising aesthetically. And I find myself wondering what the literary equivalent of that kind of turn is, or that kind of moment that it can produce. Because, you know, each one of these mediums have their own strengths and their own weaknesses, but they also share just enough in common that you can kind of draw, you know, all kinds of references out, and you know, it's not a one-to-one combination. It's never, I never get some piece of technique advice, obviously, but if I'm following a musician and it gets me really motivated to see what they're doing with their visuals, that might encourage me to think more visually in some of the ways I write scenes, because I tend to have one of my technical blocks is I don't describe scenes very well visually. Naturally, that's one of the things I have to go back and really make sure, you know, I've anchored people in the scene in a place and time that is very legible. And I can sometimes, you know, be so terse in describing things that I miss that. And so I don't just want that to be an exercise in puffing a scene out. I want to do it with some kind of style. And so just, you know, the exercise of trying to describe how a music video accomplishes a visual sense of style, that's actually helped me a little bit. I mean, but mostly it's about the puffery of like you're watching something and it just surprises you in a grand way. I love surprises that aren't plot twists, but that are just aesthetically surprising. You didn't expect that kind of sheen or that kind of depth that pops out at you. I love looking for ways to try to emulate that in my writing. And I wish I could point you to any concrete example, but I think it's more of a flow. It's more of like the energy that I'm pulling is kind of recycling that way, and hopefully, you know, the exchange is working out to my advantage at some point, you know.
Well, and this touches on one of the questions that we asked, but in a slightly different way, because one of the questions we gave you to think about ahead of time was, you know, what is your process for finding inspiration for new projects? But in what you're both talking about now, it sounds like one of the things is being open to the possibility of inspiration and kind of putting yourself in the proximity of potential inspiration, like that you're cultivating a space that you can be inspired by.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I tend to I'll have ideas in mind for a next project that fall under the category of like, I want to do something very different, or I really liked something that I was working on, some aspect of it, and I want to try to do something that expands my horizons in a given style. But in terms of the specifics, like a story hook, those things just kind of emerge for me. And the ones that survive, and the ones that I realize I'm still thinking about and that I'm starting to add pieces to, I mean, it'll take me months before I realize I finally got something that I can actually, and I'll test it out with my wife or with my close friends. I'll be like, I'm thinking about, I might do a thing where, it's an attack on a theme park and I just want to go crazy. And if it survives repeated discussions, it's usually because it's accumulating its own kind of idea mass, as it were. But I rarely ever sit down and go, today is the day I'm going to write a book where the theme is XYZ and it's going to have 10 characters who represent aspects of the problem. I can't operate like that. I'm a little more amorphous when it comes to what the next project's gonna be.
Laura, how about for you? How do you connect sort of that, the way that you go about filling yourself up during the non-generative times and the need then to find inspiration or to follow inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of love how, although we're two writers who are from radically different genres, there are some real similarities. And I think one of them is that, what do you do when you are in a sort of speculative realm? Now, for me, I'm sort of in a speculative realm of history and place. And so quite a bit of my writing centers around Shawnee history, language, but also selfhood and place is all in there too. So I'm kind of operating as a lyric poet in the way that a lot of lyric poets are, where you're looking for image and metaphor. But then I'm also operating more like a prose writer in that I'm looking at a lot of different kind of historical resources. I'm looking at language and syntax, but I still think it's that kind of, one thing that I look for is the possibility of a curve, where something that seems like just static research or a static historical narrative curves time or curves place. And that to me is like, it usually will capture my attention, or it will illuminate some kind of analogous metaphor between a moment in history or a place and maybe the present or the future. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of similarities in how all writers kind of open themselves to inspiration and also to research. But I always think of myself as just allowing a certain speculation around time and place.
Are there times when you have to shift that kind of research to be more particularly focused on, things that are going to support a current project? Like, do you have, is there a different form of research when it is more outcome focused than discovery focused?
In the past, right now I'm writing in a science fantasy realm, and even now I'm still having to do research on the science side of things. But in the past, when I've done more hard sort of science fiction, when I was a playwright, yeah, you definitely, like, I would meet with subject matter experts with the goal of like, okay, you are an expert in genetics or linguistics or what have you, and these are huge topics, and I'm a layperson. My degree is in theater. I'm never going to be a research scientist. Can you, at minimum, kind of shine a flashlight in the direction that I should start if this is my story goal, or this is the outcome, or this is the type of topic that I'm interested in? And I've had really good fortune to know some people who've been willing to be patient with me and walk me through the early stages of that kind of research. But even then, I like to do kind of I know this will sound lazy at first, but bear with me. I do as little research as I think I can get away with in order to start writing, because you can always plug the gaps in what you're missing then as you start writing, but because you'll be answering specific questions that the writing asks for, and not necessarily researching everything that you could possibly research in the world about a topic, because you could be doing that forever. And I know that this is not exactly that's there's many different ways to do research, so don't take that as any kind of this is the one way. But I like incorporating research as a parallel path to the writing, and not as an enormous chunk that happens prior to the writing. It's just, it feels like I'm making progress faster, even though that's not true. But I just, when you still have the flow of the writing happening, it's a little more fun actually to it makes it less like homework to do all that stuff, as it were.
And I think on the one hand, one of the beauties of poetry is very often it grants you incredible freedom. Usually when it comes to my sort of publishing process, I tend to rarely have to write under deadlines. Occasionally like journals or anthologies will ask me for work, but I have a lot of agency around the time. So I enjoy that. As a researcher, I tend to be, I think a challenge for me is balance, because I'm generally doing research into colonial violence. And so there's a completely different personal imperative, and it's knowing that you're going to go into a territory of a lot of harm. But also, I think that I'm more aggressive in my research than a lot of poets, because I'm not just researching as a poet, I'm researching as, an indigenous person who is also a settler colonial person. So a person of both those ancestral traditions. And I think it does lend a lot of kind of passion to my poetry, but it can also interfere with my own personal health. And you know what I mean, balance, because it's not quite the same as academic research. It's highly personal, and very often I'm approaching the research structure from a place of absolute distrust. So that's exciting tension as a writer, but it's not the same. You're in a new zone. There's no template to that. But it is fascinating. So I would say the research portion is the most significantly interesting and captivating to me as a writer.
So this question wasn't on the list, but it's come up in listening to both of your responses to the last few questions, because I'm really struck by how well each of you seem to know yourselves as writers, like the way that you're able to talk about your approach to research or inspiration. Granted, we've given you some time to think about it. We've encouraged you to think this way. But even like Scotto, you were recognizing like what are the parts of your writing that does not come naturally to you that you're going to need to work more on. Like, so how do you actually go about developing that kind of self-knowledge and self-acceptance as a writer? And again, because I'm an educator, so I'll always kind of pull it back towards encouraging young writers. But I think the question is more personal. Like, how did you arrive to that kind of understanding of yourself as a writer? And we'll start with Laura for this one, if you don't mind.
Yeah, this is a really good kind of meta question. So I think there are a couple things. I mean, the first thing that I'll be really frank about is I've had a longer career with a later start than many poets, and I find that really helpful. So I had a family, I had a 10-year career, I think, when as a teacher, when my first book came out, that had given me ample opportunity to kind of understand who I was, have a lot of different investments and worldviews around kind of my character, what I wanted to be, kind of what kind of person I wanted to be in all of my communities. And that was extremely helpful to that kind of place of self-knowledge, but also sort of self-protection. And I think that I was able to sidestep some of the real challenges of literary community, which can be things like lots of kind of sense of popularity and scarcity and, what the path has to be. So I gave myself a bit of a favor in just circumventing the path. It took a lot longer, but it allowed me to have a much greater sense of personal agency and knowledge of self. I think the other thing that is really painful but useful, and this is maybe more personal, is coming to writing, but every part of my life as sort of a biracial Indigenous person. A lot of parts of society and a lot of parts of the literary world force a marginalized position. And that's very wrong and painful, but you get this incredible perspective of, I think it forces a clearer view of what it is to be a poet. when you've been sort of marginalized by the dominant kind of poetics community. And I've tried to turn that into both kind of something to fight against, but also something to utilize to better know myself and to better know I don't have to invest in a system that tokenizes me or that marginalizes me. I can carve a different path, and then other people will benefit from that path too. So in a way, some of the challenges of the literary community, I've tried to turn into ways to better know what really is my path and what informs it.
Great approach to challenges too. It's healthier than I'm often able to be. How about you, Scotto?
I think, I was a playwright before I was an author. And so I didn't have the benefit of kind of the university level workshopping community that I hear about or that I've read about, which has, advantages and disadvantages. But for me as a playwright, I kind of forced a path of heavy workshopping of each of the major pieces. And for, if you haven't been in a theater style workshop, you get 12 actors and some designers and whatnot in a room, and they all read the play out loud right in front of you, and then right in front of you tell you immediately what they thought. And it's harrowing. And if you approach that with any sense of sensitivity about the work, you are likely to miss some of the gems that you're able to get. And I captured a quote from Twitter recently that I wanted to share that illustrates this, from the writer Delilah Dawson, who writes, "The ability to look at a long, daunting edit letter and see not an indictment, but a cheat code to level up is paramount for writers." And an edit letter is, when you send your book off to an editor, 3 months later, you'll get 100 or 10 or 5 pages full of notes of things that you might consider changing. My editor is very gentle about that, because his opinion is, it's your name on the cover of the book, so you have to be happy with it. But if it were me, this is the litany of things that I would consider adjusting. And if I hadn't had all of these theatrical, workshops, 14 years worth of them, staring me in the face, I think I could feel a lot more insecure about taking that kind of critique, because it's not criticism, it's experienced critique from peer artists who share your struggles and some of your background, and they can really help you level up. And that's been critical for me. And it also helps that I started late. I didn't really have my first major production until I was in my early 30s. I think I spent my 20s floundering as a writer and not really sure I wanted to write. So, floundering might be the wrong word. I wasn't as focused on trying to get anywhere. And partially that was this grim hopelessness of the young person who just, didn't immediately become successful, and consequently it fears that it'll never happen. And part of it was just, it's hard work, and it can be very lonely to be a writer. And sometimes I just wasn't sure I was in the mood for it. But eventually I kind of got to Seattle and settled in and started making theater happen. And so if it had happened a decade earlier, everything would have been a little weirder by the time I got to here, where, some of the hazards of publishing are not too hazardous for me anymore. They're just par for the course of being a person, I think. So.
Well, I'm curious, Scotto, if you would agree with me on this. Like, I did have the opportunity to be in both those environments you just referred to, the graduate school creative writing workshop, and a lot of those first reads of a script with a group of actors. And it's absolutely true that the creative writing workshop can be punishing, brutal. It can be just an unkind environment. And I never felt that in the first reads in theater. And I wonder, do you think it is because of the essentially collaborative nature of theater that reduces some of that competition that you get when it's a room full of just writers?
Yeah, absolutely. You can't make theater happen without every single discipline that goes into it. And so writers have more control than they do, let's say in film or television, sometimes with a play, where a playwright in professional theater can get very persnickety about making sure that every last word is spoken just exactly like you hear about little theaters getting their rights revoked because some playwright heard that they weren't producing it perfectly, and that happens today. That's not fake or whatever. But at the fringe level, where you and I, Jim, have tended to operate, it's so collaborative. We're all doing it for the love of the art, and we're not doing it because we're getting some giant amount of cash or a big spotlight of fame on us. We're doing it because we're really trying to make some innovative stuff happen. And so the critiques are, they have to be brutally honest, but they're coming from a place of, look, if we're going to put this play up, we all want it to be the strongest play that it can be. And that's so I learned a lot. I internalized a lot and kept that attitude even when now I've drifted away. Some of my beta readers are professionals, have gone through, they may not be writing currently, but one of my best beta readers went through Clarion West, and another one is a published author himself. And I get really detailed and harsh in this way feedback from them, but it's so constructive to just be able to work through with somebody who is rooting for you, and that's, I think, the key.
Laura, do you have any positive or otherwise experiences from workshop?
Yeah, it's interesting. I did not take the classic poetry MFA path. So when I came to a workshop setting, I think I had a certain sort of armor of being a published and award-winning poet. So I didn't experience it in quite the same way. I know that in conversation with friends and colleagues, it does seem that it does a lot of damage, and that it can echo the damage that happens kind of in the dominant society, where certain voices are privileged voices are privileged. But I think that in my mind, one thing that's really exciting happening in the world of poetry is there's a lot of interrogation of the classic sort of MFA critique system, and all kinds of new possibilities coming out. And I'm really excited to be part of that, where there's a more kind of inquiry-based approach to feedback, and there's a place for consent and more agency, where whereas sort of the classic model is like you as the writer to stay silent. And yeah, so I do think it's kind of in a moment of important change. And I think too, one kind of important piece in writing is poetry is a little different when it comes to professional stages and publishing. Very often you get very, very little editorial feedback. It's pretty different from all the worlds of prose writing. So, I'd say 75% of the time when I publish a poem, the editor from, let's say, a literary journal will just take it or not take it. It's very rare that I get any editorial feedback, and I have a wonderful press that gives me a whole lot of support. And basically, a copy editor goes through it. The editor may ask a few questions, but you are much more independent as a poet because it's not as much of a commercial engagement. You're not going to sell as many, they're not going to print as many. And it's, of course, a very different form of writing. So you do have to find a way to learn the craft and apply it to your own work, since there is not necessarily the safety net of editorial control. So I think poets in particular, you have to find a way. Trusted folks, your own capacity to grow as a reader of your own work. But yeah, you were more sort of a free agent in the poetry world, and you need to bring your manuscript pretty much perfect to publication, because the editorial process tends to be yes or no.
Yeah. I had forgotten that because it's been so long since I was actively trying to publish poetry. That was what I was doing in my 20s, and it felt very binary. There was never any indication of, like, it was either they liked it or I had no idea what they thought of it. They just didn't want it. How about what do you wish you knew that you do know now, but that you wish you knew when you first started into this endeavor? I'll start with Laura on this.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think for me, that actually connects to teaching, but also like other work. And one thing that I wish that I knew that took me a very long time to figure out is all the skills you build in every part of your life translate directly into your writing life. So, I'll use teaching. When you're teaching, one of the things that you have to develop is extreme executive functioning capacity. It's one of the most organized professions you could imagine. And if you can early on in your writing career understand that those strengths that you bring in from athletics or other endeavors or your other work, they translate directly into writing. All you have to do is just pop them across that binary and apply them to your writing life. That's really useful learning. And it took me a really long time to think the same way I manage a big curriculum project, I manage a manuscript. Yeah, so let your skills transfer, because they do.
I love that. Scotto, how about you?
I would say, to offer something, I agree with that was a fascinating way to put that. I hadn't even thought about that in kind of that way. This is kind of a curveball to that, which is I think that it surprised me how much I wished I had a cohort, which is like a group, a peer group that I was operating within. And you get those in a number of ways. Students obviously have the potential to help each other throughout various stages of their careers. So that's one that you hear about, or you'll go through something like Clarion West, or you'll meet at some convention and kind of build up a peer group of people who are not who are at your level and understand kind of what your specific challenges are. And I kind of came in to being an author late in life and bypassing some of those channels, and consequently I can see the existence of these bubbles of peer connection that just, it's not like theater where you're thrown into an 8-week process with a group of people, and then you may turn around 6 weeks later and be working with half of them again or whatever. Like, I don't have that currently as an author, and I'm finding it's weird, because it's not necessarily even like, it's not beta readers that I'm worried about. I've got some people who are willing to read and give feedback, but it's the professional kind of companionship that keeps you going, that I'm still kind of just searching for. So they always say, the people that you meet, and specifically I hear people that you meet in school are among the most likely to be the people that you are helping or can help you later on. And if you have that vibe, you should definitely cultivate it, because it's a neat thing to experience.
Mm-hmm. And I can tell you that being separated for the last 2 years from my teaching cohort, like the folks that I get through this daily, it has been a challenge. Like, we get to see each other on Zoom, but not having them just in the unintentional spaces, the bumping into, the informal talks. I think those are the things that I'm most lacking with not having my cohort near me right now. How about this? This is an interesting question that came from the editors, and I'm really curious to hear the answer. I'm going to start with Scotto for what's the best money you ever spent as a writer?
Oh my God. That question killed me in the face when I got it. The best money that I haven't spent yet is going to be on my chair. Like, we're getting a chair that is the most elite chair in the universe, because I have a chair that is broken right now in 2 big ways. I can't afford to replace it with the chair that I want. And it's like, nothing is more discouraging than having that chair, this super important collaborator in my life failing me regularly. It just peeves me to no end. So I don't have the savings for the chair that I want just yet, but it will happen. Yeah.
So everybody, buy books to get Scotto his chair.
Oh my goodness, that would be so lovely.
Laura, how about you?
Yeah, this is partly the realm of speculation for me. I'm not that great about this yet. However, I think the first best money you can spend as a writer is buy books. Buy books at readings always. Buy books, when folks have books with them. Buy books at your local independent bookstore. That's good money, and it's good social recognition of being part of a community. And the second, I think, is if you have the capacity to get yourself to a room of your own, a space that you can create in, that's really good money too.
Oh, I like that. I guess that kind of, it went right into the last question was going to be anyway. You've already started answering it, which is the piece of advice you'd give to aspiring writers. Because we are kind of running down on time, so this seems like a perfect way to cap things off. Laura, we'll start with you. What advice would you give to aspiring writers?
Yeah, trust your character. I think, I don't mean the character you write, trust your personal character. And don't forget to treat other writers as people. They want to see you at readings. They're excited to talk to you, but just humanize one another, model it, but also feel it. Humanize yourself and your fellow writer. That's I think the best advice I can think of.
That's lovely. Thank you. Scotto, how about you?
I guess I would say spend the energy that you have on saying nice things or positive things about the things you love, and kind of drop the habit of telling people about the things you don't care so much about. There's plenty of opportunity for other people in the world to warn each other about the things that are bad, but you as a creator need to kind of be juicing the flow of energy in a different way. You kind of need to be contributing. Look, encouragement is what people need to hear about. They want to hear about your favorite things. It's a trap to kind of start spitting out a feed of the things that you don't like. That's really easy to do. It's a lot harder to maintain a consistent flow of positivity and saying, these are the great things that I've encountered in the past 2 weeks or whatever. It's not directly tangibly related to your writing, but it's what you as a writer want to experience as well. You want the people in your sphere to be promoting you in that way, with that spirit of kind of generosity. So that's the way I look at telling. I've been a blogger in the music world for a long time, and it's always been my model to just say, these are the bands that you should look at. And I think that's the way to do it.
That's lovely. I've often said that when anyone tells me what they think is true, I will listen. And when they start telling me what they think is false, I get bored. I want to hear your truth. Scotto and Laura, thank you so much for spending the time with us today. This was a really lovely event. I hope we get to do a lot more of these, getting to just spend some time with a couple of writers chatting and hearing pieces of your work. This was fantastic. So thank you so much for doing this. Thank you to the LSR staff and the EPIC staff for organizing this, and everyone that came to share space with us today. It was really great.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Take care, all. I'm still here. I just have to cut off the YouTube stream.